Fabulous. It's our summer series today. We are covering our Thursday forms for our summer series, and we're going to dive into the contingency removal forms, the notice to performs, and the demand to close escrow. So we've got, it's a total of 5 forms. So they broke out in June, last month, since we're barely still in July, squeak it in through the end. They broke out the contingency removal form into 2 different forms. So we have a CR-B for the buyer and a CR-S for the seller. It brings me joy and happiness that they have done this. So we'll go over both of those forms. They also have the same thing. The only thing that would make me happier, just for the record, on these contingency removal forms would be if there was a place for the other party to also sign or initial for acknowledgement, but we'll talk about that later. Then there's 2 forms for the notice to perform. We have a NSP, a notice to the seller to perform, and an NBP, a notice to the buyer to perform. So we'll go over both of those. And then we'll cover the demand to close escrow. Do we have any questions before we get started today? No? All right. Fabulous. So let's hop on in. We'll start with the buyer contingency removal form. So remember here at the top, we have buyer contingency removal number blank. So you could have multiple contingency removals. There are like 8 contingencies in your contract, potentially 9. And there's some little random things that you could do. So you could have multiple contingency removals. You could have 9 contingency removals, right? Most of the time you don't. Most of the time they kind of overlap. We remove multiple contingencies all at the same time. But you would put the number of the contingency removal at the top. So if you were at number 1, it's going to be sequential. So it's never going to be like buyer contingency removal number 1 and then buyer contingency removal number A. That doesn't happen. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We just keep on going. In accordance with the terms and conditions of the purchase agreement is the default. And then you would put the date printed in the upper left-hand corner of that purchase agreement. On that first page goes there. Now, there are other options. You could be doing a contingency removal that's referencing the repair request, or the request for repair, which is the second one, the response and reply to a request for repair, the RRRR, or an other form. So if there's something that's coming into play where this contingency removal is only valid if, then we would want to address that form. So if we're just removing our contingencies, it would be to the purchase agreement. But if we're submitting a request for repairs and we're willing to remove our investigation contingency pending agreement to that repair request, we would want to reference that request for repair here rather than the purchase agreement. Okay. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Fabulous. Then you're going to put the property address here. As I've mentioned before, please make sure it's got the full address on there. It should have the street number, street name, the suffix for the street, because sometimes we might have 123 sample street and 123 sample court. And then you also want to make sure to have the city, the state, and the zip code there as well. So it should have the full address. Okay, and then your buyer's name, seller's names are going to go on there. Buyer and seller are referred to as the parties. So buyer removal of contingencies, section 1. With respect to any contingency and cancellation right that buyer removes unless otherwise agreed in a separate written agreement between buyer and seller, buyer shall conclusively be deemed to have, number 1, completed all buyer investigations and review of reports and other applicable information and disclosures, and elected to proceed with the transaction, and 3, assumed liability, responsibility, and expense, if any, for repairs, corrections, or for the inability to obtain financing. Waiver of statutory disclosures is prohibited by law. Statutory disclosures are your SPQ and your TDS, and then your lead-based paint if it's before 1978, and your earthquake hazards if it's before 1965, and your fire hazards disclosure if it was in a high or very high fire hazard zone. Those are your statutory disclosures. Oh, and your NHD report is a statutory disclosure. Okay, those are the only statutories. And then, so that's section 1, right? It's just outlining like, hey, if we remove this, we're saying that we're good to go. Okay, section 2 is buyer removes only the following individually checked buyer contingencies: The paragraph numbers refer to the car form residential purchase agreement. That's the RPA. Applicable paragraph numbers may be different for different forms. Okay. So number A is the loan. So if we're removing the loan contingency, we check this box here. The second one is the appraisal. If we're removing the appraisal contingency, we check that box here. These are and. So you could check multiple boxes or just one box, but it's not an or. So we can check multiple boxes or none at all. C is the investigation of property, paragraph 3L3, 8C, and 12, right? And here you have multiple options. So if we're removing the investigation contingency, we have the entire investigation contingency is option 1. Only the part of the investigation contingency related to the inspections concerning physical attributes of the property. All buyer investigations, including insurability, other than physical attributes, the entire buyer's investigation contingency except blank, fill in the line. And you could put, the entire buyer's investigation contingency except fire, flood, or other insurance. So there's other lines here that you can fill in, right? So you've got all that in there. You've got the review of seller's documents. So that would be, we're removing all of the seller's documents. We're removing all of the seller's documents except, and there should be a line to fill in here, and it's broken. There is no line, but you should be able to fill something in there except the government reports, the statutory disclosures and other disclosures, or other. Okay, so right, so you have options. So if we're reviewing the seller documents and we're removing that contingency, it would be either be review of all of them or review of, I know why this doesn't have an except. It would be a review of the seller documents except, and you would either put in the government reports, statutory disclosures, or other. So here's where you fill in that except line down here. Okay. The next one is the preliminary title report. That's a contingency. The F is a common interest or HOA disclosures. G is the review of leased or liened items. H is the sale of the buyer's property. And here's what I really like about the changes to this new form is we have the button for entering into contract for the buyer's property and a second button for the close of escrow for the buyer's property. Fabulous. Thank you, Car Forms, for doing that for us. And then we have another line here for I. Okay, so section 2 is we can hand pick the contingencies that we're removing. If there's, and this is usually used for like we're removing less than we're not. Okay. If we're, let's say we're removing, does anybody have any questions so far about section 1 or section 2? Okay, section 3 gives you more options. So maybe instead of we're, removing only the following. So this would be like, hey, I'm only removing the loan contingency. That's usually where we utilize this. Or, hey, we're removing the preliminary title, right? So we're just hand picking some that we're removing. If we're going to remove most of our contingencies, then we would use section 3, which is all buyer contingencies are removed except. So, right. So we usually use this for like the investigation, seller disclosures, all of those, the preliminary title report. So all of these kind of listed up here under investigation of property, the physical investigation, everything but the physical attributes, the insurability of the property, seller's documents, government reports, statutory disclosures, preliminary title report, common interest, review and list of liened items. Like usually we're kind of removing all of that together. We would come down here and check this box, and then we could say, hey, but we're not removing the loan and the appraisal contingency yet, right? Or we're not removing the appraisal contingency yet. Maybe that appraisal is not in yet. Okay, so this, we would use all buyer contingencies are removed except, and your options are except loan, except appraisal, except contingency for close of buyer's property, condominium planned development, HOA disclosures, or other. Now keep in mind here that if there is a contingency for the sale of the buyer's property, we usually default that to the close of escrow of buyer's property. And so we would want to make sure that we would always leave this outstanding until that buyer's contingency is removed. So maybe we're removing the loan, the appraisal, all the contingencies with regards to the house we're purchasing, but our buyers are still selling a property, we would want to check this box where all buyer contingencies are removed except the contingency for the close of buyer's property. Okay. Or maybe they're not even entered into contract yet. So it might be other contingency for the close of buyer's property and contingency for entering into contract for buyer's property. Okay, so maybe we're not doing either of those. The reason they don't have that option down here, number one, is that oftentimes on our COP form, our contingency for the sale of the buyer's property, oftentimes we don't start the time frames for our inspections and stuff until we enter into contract on a replacement or until they enter into contract on their property. Somebody's going to buy it, but sometimes we start them sooner than that. So we would want to make sure that we leave those outstanding if we're not in contract yet, or if it hasn't closed escrow. Okay. The other option that we have, so we have, right, we can hand pick those contingencies we're removing in section 1. Section 3 is, hey, we're removing most of the contingencies except maybe 1 or 2, and we can identify those here. The other one that you might want to stay tuned with here as well, because I know with a lot of our newer agents branching into the Zillow world, we have a lot more mobile home deals going through right now. They're also cheaper, so that's one reason. But the contingency for park approval is on the mobile home purchase addendum that we include with our purchase agreement, and it stipulates on there that it's part of the investigation contingency. So the park approval, to make sure your buyers are approved by the park for occupancy in that mobile home, that approval is part of that investigation contingency. So if you haven't gotten park approval yet, you would want to make sure you stipulate this here, that, hey, we're removing all of our contingencies except park approval of buyers, right? So we want to leave that in there until we get park approval from the park itself. Okay. Now, if you're like, man, I'm done, I don't have a contingency for the sale of another property, we've got the park approval, everything's ready to go, we can just come in here and check box number 4. The buyer hereby removes any and all buyer contingencies. That's how you remove them all at once without having to check a bunch of boxes. Okay. And keep in mind that these are OR boxes. So we're either going to check boxes in 2, or we're going to check boxes in 3, or we're going to check box number 4. We're not going to check multiple sections. Okay, each section stands by itself. Any questions about sections 1 through 4? How to remove those contingencies? All right. 5 is, once all contingencies are removed, whether or not the buyer has satisfied themselves regarding all contingencies or received any information relating to those contingencies, buyer may not be entitled to a return of buyer's deposit if buyer does not close escrow. This could happen even if, for example, the buyer does not approve some aspect of the property, or lender does not approve the buyer's loan, right? We're removing our contingencies. We're saying we're good. So now even if the lender comes back and denies our loan, we're going to be out that deposit. Okay. Note, if this form is attached to a request for repairs, CAR form RR, the seller response and buyer reply to a request for repairs, CAR form RRRR, or any other form or document such as an addendum, CAR form ADM, or an amendment to the existing agreement, CAR form AEA, it is only valid if the buyer and the seller agree to the request made on that form and or document. Okay, so that's why it's super important what we put up here, that it's referencing. If it's in response to and only valid if both parties agree to it, then we want to make sure we make this form reference that form at the top. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? Yes, no?
Ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. All right. Then your buyer signs this form. So we fill it out, buyer signs it. Okay, there is no place on this form for the seller to sign. Sorry, it's sad. I usually on my listings have my sellers go ahead and initial the contingency removal form, just so we have it in the file that we've received it and that it's part of it, and my sellers are aware they've removed contingencies. I think it's important. I think they should have initials on here. But regardless of whether the sellers initial it or not, the buyer signs it. They send it over to us electronically. Those contingencies are removed. Okay. Now, keep in mind too, that oftentimes with my buyers, I don't remove contingencies. Well, okay. So in our California contract, the contingencies are not automatically removed. They have to be removed in writing, which means we have to submit a contingency removal form, or on the request for repair, there's a place where contingencies are automatically removed based on that request for repairs without a separate CR form. Sorry, I'm yawning. But they have to be removed in writing and signed. If our contingency removal date was yesterday and we didn't physically remove those contingencies in writing, that contingency is still outstanding. So oftentimes with my buyers, I will allow that contingency to just roll on out there until the seller really pesters me for the removal of those contingencies. So oftentimes I'm not removing these contingencies until the close of escrow. If I can have one contingency removal that says I'm removing all of them and it's pretty darn close to the close of escrow, that makes me happy. Now, oftentimes too, just so you know, once those contingencies are due and they're ready to be removed, right? Our inspection contingencies due, our seller disclosures are due. We'll have a conversation between me and my buyers and say, hey, the contingencies are due. Are we ready to remove those contingencies? They're going to be like, yes. I'm going to be like, perfect. I'm going to send you over that contingency removal form. So I send it over to the contingency removal form, and then they sign it and I sit on it until that seller's agent starts pestering me for it. So my buyers think the contingencies have been removed. But if something comes up a week from today and they're like, oh my gosh, Amy, we had no idea. And is there any way for us to get out of this? I'm gonna be like, yeah, actually, like I had you sign the contingency removal form, but I haven't actually sent it over yet. So those contingencies haven't actually been removed. So we can cancel. So I sit on them as long as possible. That's just how I roll my buyer transactions. Also keep in mind that if we remove the seller disclosures contingency, and then the sellers or the listing agent gives us more information with regards to a material defect of the property, our buyers have an additional 3 days. Even though they removed that contingency, they have additional 3 days to review and think about the material defect, and they could cancel based on those new findings. So just kind of keep that in mind. Maciel, did you have a question?
I was just going to say, right after you said that you can cancel because you never turned them in, I was going to say, insert little devil horns here. A little purple emoji.
Yes. Right. So you can, that's why I sit on them. Now, as a listing agent, I won't let a buyer's agent sit on their contingency removals. I want those contingencies removed. This is why I go back to, if you're representing both the buyer and the seller, how do you do that well for both parties and protect their interests? Like when it comes to contingency removals, my intention with my buyers is to never remove those contingencies, and my intention with my seller is to, I'm going to serve you a notice to perform to get those contingencies removed. It just becomes very hard to represent both parties. Do you have something else, Maciel?
Nope. That was
all right. So there's your buyer's contingency removal form. Any questions about that before we move to the seller contingency removal form? All right, moving right along. Seller contingency removal form, an awful lot like the buyer contingency removal at the top. It's got a contingency removal there. You would put number 1 in accordance with the terms and conditions of the purchase agreement, or we could check the box for request for repair, response and reply to request for repair, or other. I would very rarely would you ever have a seller contingency that's dependent on a request for repair. So it's odd that they put those up there, but anyways, they're there. Property known as, again, put the full address. You got buyer's names, seller's names. Those are the parties. Seller removal of seller contingencies. With respect to any contingency and cancellation right that the seller removes, unless otherwise agreed to in a separate written agreement between the buyer and seller, seller shall conclusively be deemed to have completed all actions and investigations related to such contingency, elected to proceed with the transaction, and assumed all liability, responsibility, and expense, if any, for continuing without the contingency. Waiver of statutory disclosures is prohibited by law. The sellers have very few reasons they can cancel a contract based on their own contingencies, and those contingencies are as follows. The seller hereby removes the following seller contingencies. One would be if they put into place a SPRP, or the seller's purchase of replacement property, identifying that the close of escrow of this property is dependent on the seller's finding a replacement property. That would be number one. And number two would be closing on that replacement property. So finding and closing on the replacement property. And then there's a line for other, in case there was some other contingency that was built in there. Maybe the deal was contingent on the seller being able, maybe the seller was selling part of their property and the sale of those additional acres was dependent on them subdividing the property. So maybe there was a contingency for approval of the subdivision. Then that's where that other line would come into play. So there's very few random things that you would put in there. There's no contingencies in the regular purchase agreement for the seller. Zero. So for it to be a contingency with the seller, we have to use that SPRP form, the finding or closing on replacement property, and then, or we would have to identify something else that the sale would be contingent upon. Okay, seller signs this one. Again, there's no place for the buyer to sign. If the seller removed a contingency, I would absolutely have my buyers initial this, that they received it and that they are aware that the seller removed that contingency. So there's never any questions. Any thoughts or questions on the seller contingency removal form? All right. Moving right along. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Anastasia.
I said, no, ma'am.
Oh, fabulous. All right, we're going to move on to the notice to the buyer to perform. So again, these are numbered. It would be sequential. You might receive multiples. We don't get scared when we see these. But we do have to then comply. So oftentimes I'll get these for my buyers because I don't remove those contingencies and they'll drag on. And now we're on like day 23 of a contract where I should have removed them on day 14. And then I get the notice to perform. No big deal. I just submit the contingency removal. It's super simple. So in accordance with the terms and conditions of the purchase agreement or other, dated, right? We're going to put the date in the upper left-hand corner of that purchase agreement on the first page, put in the full property address, buyer's names, seller's names. The buyer and seller are referred to as parties. The seller hereby, right, this is the notice to the buyer to perform, so it's always served by the seller. The seller hereby gives buyer notice to, as applicable, remove the specified contingencies and take the specified contractual action as follows. If for any contingency or contractual action selected, this NBP, notice to buyer to perform, is delivered before the time permitted in the agreement, the notice shall be void for only those specific contingencies or contractual actions, but this notice to buyer to perform shall be valid for all other contingencies and contractual actions selected. If all contingencies is selected, this notice to buyer to perform is valid for only the contingencies for which the delivery of this notice is within the time permitted in the agreement and void as to the others. Okay, and you're like, Amy, what does that mean? Okay, in our residential purchase agreement, the default is a 20 or 48-hour notice to perform, or 2 days. It's really a 2-day notice to perform. So as a seller, I can submit a notice to the buyer to perform up to 2 days prior to that action being due. I cannot submit it 3 or 4 days prior to that action. So I couldn't enter into contract with Maciel to sell a house to her clients and then turn around the next day and serve her a notice to perform for all the contingencies based on their due dates. Okay, I can't do that. I have to wait until 2 days before that is due to be able to serve a notice to perform. And if I serve it before then for anything that's not due, it would be considered invalid. Okay, so a notice to buyer to perform can be given up to 2 days before any action is due or any time after that period. Okay, any questions about that? All right. On side 1, we have the contingencies. On side 2, we have the contractual actions. So if a seller is looking to cancel a contract, maybe they got a backup offer that's much better than the buyer's original offer, and they want to move forward with a backup offer. These are all the reasons the seller can cancel a contract if the buyer doesn't complete the action, right? So contingencies here, we have loan appraisal, buyer investigation, including insurability, review of seller documents, including disclosures and reports. We have the title or preliminary title report, the condominium, the planned development disclosures, the review of leased and liened items, entering into contract for sale of buyer's property, closing escrow on buyer's property, or any other contingency that the buyer has added to the contract. Okay, that would be J and K. So those are the contingencies as stated in the residential purchase agreement, if they are involved or not, right? Somebody may have removed some of those at the time of offer, but those are the ones they have the option of as far as contingencies. Now, contractual actions are on side 2, and we start with L. We have the initial deposit, right? It's due, the default is 3 business days after accepted offer. We have delivery of increased deposit, delivery of signed liquidated damage clause with increased deposit. That's the form that we went over, the DID form, I think it was last week. Updated lender information. So if you've changed lenders from what the original disclosure was of the lender, the seller can request updated lender information. You have to provide it. I believe it's within 2 days. It may be within 24 hours. Check the contract for that. But you'd have to provide that. If you didn't, they can serve you a notice to perform. The notice of VA and FHA requirements. So that defaults to 17 days. Verification of funds, right? Providing proof of funds, verification of loan application, assume or accept leased or liened items if they are existing. So, right, so we can have the contingency is the review of the leased and liened items, and part of the contractual action is that you accept or assume those leased or liened items. The review of the statutory or return of the statutory disclosures, the return of the lead disclosures, right? So if you're not returning documents signed by the buyer, they can serve you a notice to perform. The return of the signed fire hardening and defensible space advisory disclosure and addendum. Comply with title's efforts to comply with the GTO. That's the basic information. The assignee's delivery of pre-approval or pre-qualification. So if we're assigning it to another buyer or adding a buyer, then this would come into play. Delivery of evidence of authority to act. That would be if we have a representative capacity on the contract. It's a corporation, a trust, a probate, whatever it is, somebody buying it that's not themselves. Escrow evidence, sale of buyer's property, right? So that would be providing them evidence that the buyer's property has entered into escrow. So not only do we have a contingency we can remove, but we also have to provide proof, which is a copy of the purchase agreement and the escrow information. Escrow evidence of the sale of the buyer's property. Evidence of listing the buyer's property. So, right, so evidence that it's listed, or evidence of removal of contingencies in the buyer's property. So if we have that COP form in place, the contingency for sale of buyer's property, we're supposed to provide our seller with proof that the buyer of our property has removed their contingencies, right? This gets really difficult, especially if you have more sales involved and it's like this long dominoes, or CC is a blank line. Any questions about all those things that you could be served a notice to perform for? All right, we're serious here about our notice to performs. Note, paragraph numbers refer to the residential purchase agreement, car form RPA. Applicable paragraph numbers for each contingency or contractual action in other car contracts may be different. Buyer, if you do not remove the specified contingencies, car form CR or RR, and take the specified contractual actions indicated above within 2 days. The only time it would be less than 2 days is if we had changed that in the residential purchase agreement when the offer was submitted. Okay, no less than 2 days as specified in the agreement. Days after delivery of this notice to buyer perform, seller may cancel the agreement. Now, keep in mind, well, seller signs this form and then serves it to the buyer. Now, notice there's no place for the buyer to sign this notice to perform. Again, I think that's probably an error, but whatever. I would probably have my buyers initial this just so they are acknowledged that the buyers have received a copy of this. Okay, right? If I'm trying to get them to remove something or complete an action, this will help them move that right along. You could give them longer. So maybe they ask for an extension of time, and instead of extending that time, maybe they ask for 3 more days or 4 more days to review the to have another inspection done. And you're like, well, I don't want to, I truly don't want to extend the time, but I do want to give them a little bit more time. I'm going to serve them a notice to perform that, hey, I'm not going to force you to remove those contingencies today. I'm going to give you 4 days. But that allows me that if you don't remove it on that 4th day that you've asked for, I can cancel right then. Whereas if I would have signed the extension of time, now I would have had to wait 2 days to serve the notice to perform for them to remove that. So this alleviates that. Oftentimes, just so you know, most of my listings, I do not approve extension of time addendums. It just prolongs the process. I might give them more time, but I'm not gonna like put it in writing. So anyways, so you can adjust that, but otherwise it has to be given at least 2 days prior to the due date, or not 2 days prior to the due date, but you have to give them 2 days to perform. Now, if the performance day falls on a weekend or a holiday, it rolls to the next business day. So if I serve a notice to perform on Thursday, the buyers have all day Friday, right? So whatever day you serve it on is day 0. They have the next 2 days till the end of the day to perform. So they would have all day Friday and all day Saturday to perform. And because Saturday is a weekend or a holiday, that actually rolls to Monday. So they would have all day Friday and all day Monday to perform. I can't cancel until Tuesday. Okay. So just kind of keep that in mind when serving a notice to perform or receiving a notice to perform, is that weekends and holidays don't count. Okay. Now, if it got served to me on Wednesday, I would have all day Thursday and all day Friday to perform. Sellers could cancel on me on Saturday because I had the full 2 days to perform. My performance day didn't land on a weekend. Sellers can cancel on a Saturday. So just kind of keep that in mind. Any questions about this notice to the buyer to perform? All right, we're moving right along then to the notice to the seller to perform. Very similar to the buyer, we're going to fill in a number up here at the top. It defaults to the purchase agreement or other form where we can date it right here, whatever the date of that form is. Keep in mind, I always mention the purchase agreement, which is the printed date on the upper left-hand corner of the first page of the purchase agreement. If it's another form that you're referencing that doesn't have that pre-printed date on it, it's going to be the date in which that form was signed by the parties submitting it. Okay. So if it was like I don't know, a repair request, it would be the date that the buyers signed that repair request to submit it to the sellers. That would be the date of the form. Okay. Property known as full address, buyer's name, seller's names. Obviously the buyers and sellers are referred to as parties. Buyer, this is a buyer giving the seller a notice to perform. The buyer hereby gives seller notice that the buyer has not yet received from seller the items checked below. If seller does not provide the buyers with these items, buyer may be entitled to cancel the agreement or delay removing the applicable contingency. Okay. Contractual action. A is delivery of information related to leased or liened items or systems. B would be the following fully completed statutory and supplemental disclosures, TDS, NHD, SPQ, ESD, for example, paragraphs 3N1 and 11A, and then you would list whichever ones you have not yet received. Now, keep in mind here, it says fully completed. That means that every answer has to be marked either yes or no, and anything that was marked yes needs an explanation on it on that SPQ or that TDS or that ESD. Okay, they need to be fully filled out, signed, dated, everything answered. Otherwise, it's not fully completed, and you can serve the notice to perform to get that fully completed form. Okay, keep in mind that anytime a notice to perform, it's a 2-day notice to perform per the default in the residential purchase agreement. So same thing here is we can't, serve this way in advance. This would just be like, hey, our time period to remove this contingency is coming due and we haven't yet received this, and you had 7 days to do it, and here we are on day 8. Like, you need to provide these forms. You've got the fully completed lead disclosure. Again, that's for properties built before 1978. The fire hardening and defensible space advisory disclosure and addendum. That's for properties in high fire or very high fire hazard severity zones. The following guides or booklets, earthquake and environmental hazards, for example, those are usually hyperlinked to your NHD report, which is why it's important to make sure that the buyer gets a copy of all of those forms and documents, or the page that has those hyperlinks in it so they can access them. Your condominium or plan development disclosures, disclosure of known property insurance claims, delivery of preliminary title, disclosure and evidence of authority to act in a representative capacity, delivery of the following inspection report. So if you knew that the seller had inspections done previously, you could ask for those reports. They would be required to provide those to you, or if there's any that the seller was supposed to complete on during the transaction. Any other disclosures or deliveries. Here's the removal of abandoned personal property. Right? So if we close escrow and the seller leaves behind trash or personal property, we can serve this notice for the sellers to remove that abandoned or personal property. They actually have 3 days to remove that personal property before the buyer can take action on it. Other item is MNN. And then if the sellers had the SPRP in place, the seller's purchase of replacement property contingencies, you could also serve them a notice to perform to remove the finding replacement property contingency or the close of replacement property contingency or another contingency that was identified. The paragraph numbers refer to the residential purchase agreement, CAR form RPA. Applicable paragraph numbers for each contingency or contractual action in other CAR contracts may be different. Seller, if you do not take the contractual action specified above within no less than 2 days as specified in the agreement, right? So 2 is the default. However, if we're doing this removal of abandoned personal property, we would need to move this to 3. I think there's actually a separate form for that as well now. But anyways, after delivery of this notice to the seller to perform, buyer may cancel the agreement, notwithstanding the previous sentence, if the contractual action is for removal of abandoned personal property. Seller shall be given at least 3 days to perform. There you go. It's on there. So there you go. That's how it gets filled out. The buyer signs it and submits it to the seller. Again, there's no place for the seller to sign this form. So if it were me, buyer submits this, I would have my sellers initial this form confirming that they've seen it and received it. Any questions about the notice to the seller to perform? All right. Seller, oh, we did that already. So buyer signs it and we're done. Dun, dun, dun. That's the notice to the seller to perform. Now, notice on the contractual actions, it doesn't say anything about close of escrow here. And on these contractual actions, nothing about the close of escrow here. That's because the close of escrow, if we're demanding that we close escrow, is a whole separate form. That one is called the demand to close escrow. So for everything but close of escrow, we use the notice to perform. For the close of escrow, we're going to use the DCE form, or the demand to close escrow. In accordance with the terms and conditions of the purchase agreement, or blank, right? We fill that in and check that box, dated blank. On the property known as, please fill in the full address, buyer's names, seller's names, with an agreed upon close of escrow date of blank. So whatever that close, oops, that's not going to be the close of escrow date. There we go. Now, keep in mind, too, that our close of escrow date, if it falls on a weekend or a holiday, it automatically rolls to the next business day. So if, we counted out 30 days on a 30-day contract and that landed on day 29 or Saturday the 29th, our close of escrow would actually automatically roll to the 31st. Okay, so agreed upon close of escrow date there. We're just going to put the 28th. Seller hereby demands that buyer close escrow on property within 3 days is the default. After delivery of this demand to close escrow, but no earlier than the agreed upon close of escrow date. So again, we can't serve this before 3 days. We couldn't enter into contract on a property and serve a demand to close escrow for the anticipated close of escrow date. We have to wait until 3 days before. Or by blank date, which is at least, right? So we can either do a specific number of days within 3 days after delivery of this demand to close escrow is the default, or we can put in a specific date here. Okay. Oops, that wouldn't work because we're serving it today. So it'd have to at least be 3 days. We have all day tomorrow, the next day, and Sunday. So we could say Monday. Okay, which is at least 3 days after delivery of this demand to close escrow, but no earlier than the agreed upon close of escrow date. You're like, Amy, why would this come into play? Generally, we would serve a 3-day, but maybe the sellers, maybe we've said, hey, we need an extension of the close of escrow until August 4th because we're waiting for something to come in that's supposed to come in that week, right? And so maybe they're like, hey, we're not going to agree to your extension of time for the close of escrow. We're going to give you more time, but I'm going to serve this demand to close escrow that we must close escrow by the 4th or we're going to cancel the agreement. Okay. Note to buyer. So that's where you would use the maybe days versus a date. If you do not close escrow by the end of the time specified in this demand to close escrow and the seller has fully performed, seller may immediately cancel this agreement, bring legal action against you for damages, including but not limited to the deposit, or bring legal action against you to force you to buy the property specific performance. Okay, so those are your warnings to your buyer. That's on the demand to close escrow. Those are the options. Any questions on that top section for the seller's demand to close escrow? Okay, seller signs this form here. It's done. The second section is the buyer. So if the seller provides this demand to close escrow, seller signs here. Your buyers do not sign down here. If you want your buyers to acknowledge they received it, you would just have them initial on the form. Don't sign this bottom section. This bottom section is if the buyers are serving a notice or demand to close escrow to the sellers. So the buyer hereby demands that the seller close escrow on the property. A is within 3 days after delivery of this demand to close escrow, but no earlier than the agreed upon close of escrow date. Or B is by a specific day, which is at least 3 days after delivery of this demand to close escrow, but no earlier than the agreed upon close of escrow date. So same options for the buyer as with the seller there. And then you have a note to the seller. If you do not close escrow by the end of the time period specified in this demand to close escrow and buyer has fully performed, buyer may bring legal action against you for damages because of your breach of contract, right? That would be like, hey, the buyer's having to rent a property now because you didn't close escrow and they can go after you for those funds, right? Something like that. Bring legal action against you to force you to sell the property, specific performance, or both, right? The sellers have entered into a contract to sell their property with the buyers. There's little to no way for the sellers to get out of that contract if the buyers are performing and completing all the contractual actions. So the buyers can go after the sellers and force them to sell the property and also go after them for any damages or any costs incurred by them. So we fill out this, buyers sign here. Now, if the buyers are serving this demand to close escrow, buyers sign here. Sellers do not sign up here. If you want your sellers to acknowledge they received a copy of it and it's serious, we're going to have sellers initial it. I would ultimately probably have my sellers initial somewhere near this paragraph and have my buyers initial somewhere near this paragraph if the sellers had submitted it. That way, I'm saying, hey, buyers, please read this note to the buyers of what the consequences are of continuing to drag your feet on closing escrow, or hey, sellers, please note what the consequences, right? We want them to be aware. So instead of having my sellers initial like at the top of the page that they've received it, I would have them initial next to this paragraph. Any questions about that demand to close escrow?
I didn't even know there was a form like that.
It's
So
not
many
very
forms.
often that we have to use it. Yeah, any other questions? Everybody good to go? We've got our.
I have a question. I think there was an agent that was telling me that, you know, she's like sent out notices to perform, and that agent is like, you know, she chose not to do inspections, and then all of a sudden she decided she want to start doing inspections like over the inspection contingency time, like period. And so like the agent that I know is like, she wants to basically remove them like the day before they're supposed to close. And she's like, this is like crazy. So I was just wondering,
Yeah.
like, I guess that she can send out a letter like that, but that other agent is just being like super hard to work with.
Yeah. So, right. So, our job is to protect the interest of our clients. So if I've got the buyers, I'm there to protect the interest of my buyers. And sometimes our buyers are stupid and we have an inspection period and you're like, hey, what inspections do you want? And they're like, we don't want any. And then you're like, hey, it's time to remove those contingencies. So I'm going to send that over to you for removal. And they're like, wait, we decided we wanted a home inspection. We talked to somebody this weekend. They said we should have one. Like, we want to have one. Can we get that scheduled? And you're like, no, you're outside your time. So then you submit like, hey, we'd like an extension of time because my buyers are stupid. Right. And then we're like trying to drag our feet on removing those contingencies. Again, if it's me, I'm trying to drag my feet until the close of escrow to remove contingencies. Anyways, I usually don't submit a extension of time request unless there's a legit reason for it. But sometimes buyers are stupid or other agents are stupid. So things get dragged out. So our options as a listing agent is, hey, we can submit the notice to perform or the demand to close escrow. And that doesn't mean we're going to cancel the contract. The contract isn't automatically canceled once we reach the expiration of that notice to perform. It just gives us the ability to cancel. So if you've got an agent that's just totally being a turd and not removing things and just dragging things out, your option is to serve that notice to perform. And then your option is whether you want to cancel or not. And oftentimes what I'll do in that situation as a listing agent is the notice to perform. I'll put the property back as active on the MLS, and in the private remarks, I'll put pending cancellation of current offer. Because I've served my notice to perform, I can cancel on them the second I get a backup offer. I don't necessarily want to cancel on them because I would like to get this thing closed. I don't want to have to start over again. So if I get a reasonable offer or a better offer, I might accept it, but I don't want to like completely cancel on my buyers. Because ultimately it's easier to close a week late than it is to put it into a new contract, go through all the investigations again, go through the loan and the appraisal, and 30 days later, we're finally closing. Like, I would rather get it closed. But as a listing agent, once I serve that notice to perform, I will put the property back as active on the market, pending cancellation of current offer, so that people know that, hey, we just have to serve that notice of cancellation and then we can move forward with you. It's a great way to get some movement on those buyers, because sometimes we serve that notice to perform and they're like, are they really serious? They're not really going to cancel on us. Like, that would be stupid of them to start all over. They don't have a backup offer yet. But when the buyers see that property come back as active on their home search, then it stresses them out a little bit. And they're like, I think we're going to lose this property. We got to get on the ball and get things done. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yep.
So, perfect. Any other questions with regards to any of these forms or any other form? Fabulous. Well, thank you everyone for joining me today. I really appreciate it. In the chat box is the link to log your attendance for today's class. And as always, there's a little box where you can make suggestions of future trainings that you would like to see. We're preparing to put together the fall training calendar. We're bringing back Rev Up, and we'll be covering some other things as well. So if there's something you would like to see in that, throw it in that box and we'll make sure to incorporate it into the schedule. Today is Thursday, so we will not be back tomorrow, but we will be back next week. And next week we have some exciting things coming. I don't know what they are, but I'll tell you. Let's see, today is the 27th. So on Tuesday, we have creating a buyer consultation. So we'll talk about that buyer consultation and how to create that buyer consultation packet on Tuesday. And that's it. Sorry, that's Tuesday at 3. On Wednesday at 9 a.m., Jessica will be joining us back for Dream Big with Jumbo Loans. Turn your luxury home aspirations into reality. We'll be talking about jumbo loans. They're a little bit more difficult than a regular conventional loan. So she'll be going over all of those. And then on Thursday at 3 o'clock, we'll be covering the ESD, the FHDS, the solar, and the DIA. So that's your exempt seller disclosure, your I don't even know what the FHDS is right now. Your solar talks about the solar disclosure. If your property has solar, you need to use that form. And then your disclosure information advisory, which is by far my favorite advisory out of all of the car forms library. So we'll be covering that on Thursday. So we'll see you next week. Holler at me if you need anything before then. And again, thanks for joining.